Bully is a game with a unique charm to it, straddling a line between relatable and surreal, nostalgic and unbelievable. On one hand, it's a game where you're subject to an 11 PM curfew and mandatory class attendance, but on the other hand, it's a game with a hobo who gets abducted by aliens, a fight with ventilation pipes over glowing green chemicals, and full-blown anarchy in a school. Though at a fundamental level, it's firmly rooted in the Rockstar Games tradition of third-person open-world games, it feels wholly unique. Missions stray away from the basic go here, shoot this structure that forms the meat and potatoes of the Grand Theft Auto franchise, and the youthful charm of the relatable yet cartoon-like characters is a break from Rockstar's men with guns, who form the totality of their output. I would argue the main aspect of Bully's everlasting charm is Shawn Lee's score. Bully's soundtrack is perfect, and it is so for one main reason. It captures the dichotomy that Bully represents perfectly. Youthful, innocent charm, but also a violence, a darkness, and a surreal, magical quality. So for this video, I interviewed Shawn Lee about his process of making the score, as well as taking a closer look at the music itself. But before we get into that, let's examine its genesis and why it is a distinctive diamond in Rockstar's catalogue. The story of Bully's music begins with Ivan Pavlovich, the director of music at Rockstar Games. Pavlovich has been cementing himself for decades in the music industry, cutting his teeth DJing in the Chicago house scene most nights, building a network of connections that has allowed Rockstar to leverage huge names in music over the years to work with them, from Phil Collins to Ice-T to Axl Rose to Flying Lotus to Julian Casablancas. Lee describes working under Pavlovich as a highly intense process.
They were cracking the whip. I mean, I think he spent 8 months doing it, like full time pretty much. I remember at one point, him telling me later, his bosses told him, "Hey man, you need to lay off this guy a little." You know what I mean? You're really working him really hard, And he was like, "No, you can take it."
Pavlovich has always emphasised the importance of music in Rockstar's games, saying that the music always supports the game, and we're usually there from the beginning. Music at Rockstar has always played a very heavy role. In the forefront, we're supporting all the action, and we actually get to score the gameplay, so I think we're heavily involved from the beginning. We sit down with Sam Houser, who's the founder, and we decide on the direction for the radio stations and how these may relate to the gameplay. Being a AAA studio, Rockstar has the money to license real-world music to use in their games, and it often does, but the nature of Bully represents a unique problem. The licensed real-world music that plays in the Grand Theft Auto franchise takes on the form of the radio in the cars, but Bully doesn't feature drivable cars. Instead, transport takes place on foot, skateboard, bicycle, moped, go-kart, and lawnmower. Modes of transport without the built-in radio of cars. As a result of this, an original score was necessary in order to create a vibrant sound world. Pavlovich has praised Rockstar's founding brothers for their passion for music and willingness to work with underground artists, leaving the decision of Bully's composer to Pavlovich alone. This is where we come to Shawn Lee, Bully's composer, who was hired by Pavlovich on the basis of just one song. Whilst Lee can't remember exactly which song it was, he does remember the album and some features of the song, and having listened to the whole album, one song fits these criteria significantly above others. The album is called Moods and Grooves by Shawn Lee's Ping Pong Orchestra, and the song is called Skunky Funky. Since the song contains a mixture of groove-driven sections with the drum kit and bass, as well as percussionless, synth-based ambient sections, Pavlovich saw this track as evidence of the breadth of Lee's musical capabilities, and not long afterwards, Lee would be sat at a meeting with Rockstar officials in New York, signing NDAs and agreeing to become composer for a video game, something he'd never done in full before, and a video game for which he wasn't even told the name. So this begs the question, who is Shawn Lee? Self-defining as a musician, producer, and composer, Shawn Lee was born in 1963 and grew up in Wichita, Kansas. Here's Lee to talk about his introduction to music and the guitar and some of his earlier musical influences.
Classic rock and what's become classic soul and all these kind of things were kind of the music that was on the radio when I was young. So yeah, I mean all the Hendrix and the Beatles and the Stones and Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, that sort of classic rock from the 60s and the 70s and just all of it. I mean, anybody you would name. it was like rock, soul, funk, country, a bit of blues, it was all that kind of stuff that was, that's held up as being classic music now. That was the music I was hearing when I was a kid. And also I started to hear the sort of kind of jazz stuff. Like I remember when Headhunters came out, that was a really big record for musicians.
Leaving Kansas in the 1980s, Lee would move to Los Angeles, where he would work with names such as the Dust Brothers and Jeff Buckley. There exists somewhere a long-lost tape of Buckley and Lee jamming Rolling Stones' classic Honky Tonk Woman. Lee's influences span a wide variety of music, accounting for the eclectic mix of styles in the Bully soundtrack, from Ennio Morricone to the Spice Girls, the Prodigy, to the Isley Brothers. Drawing from this wide array of influences, Lee's career before Bully saw him partake in a number of projects, working extensively with his instrumental outfit, the Ping Pong Orchestra, as well as being one half of the yacht rock duo Young Guns Silver Fox, and having Will Young, of all people, cover a cult song of his whilst he toiled away on the Bully soundtrack. Lee's resources for scoring the game were extremely limited, with Rockstar not wanting to let much information about their upcoming game out. Composing for games provides certain challenges, with the dynamic nature of video games making it sometimes a more complicated beast than traditional film music. Video game composer Brian L. Schmidt has described video game composing as rather similar to film composing in the 1920s, as an art form still finding its feet. Lee's score here takes a more traditional, filmic approach, with fully formed pieces making up the soundtrack, rather than dynamically evolving blocks of music that chain together according to the events of the game. Something else that sets the Bully score apart from many games, especially ones around the same time as Bully, is the acoustic element of the music. Lee doesn't play to a click track and is a fan of acoustic instruments compared to MIDI ones.
I don't own a MIDI keyboard. My approach is to use all physical instruments. I don't enjoy doing stuff in the box. It just doesn't give me any satisfaction. If I was doing like a synth keyboard sound or something, I'd much rather be doing that, even though you could have unlimited synths in the box and things that are quite powerful in terms of the sound sculpting aspect of it. I'd much prefer to take a Casio keyboard and put it through a wah-wah pedal. You know what I mean? It's more fun, and the outcome is a little bit more unpredictable. You just can't beat the sort of physical interface.
Lee also had another challenge. What should this music actually sound like? How would he make the score cohesive? Rockstar provided Lee with lots of music as inspiration, but the way in which he makes the score cohesive across a wide variety of styles is a testament to his musical prowess.
I thought, well, how am I going to tie these things together and make them sound like a score rather than like needle drops from different records? You know what I mean? Like, this is that thing and that's that thing. And so I started to think about these instruments and think, well, if this is more like the Chemical Brothers, Prodigy, big beat kind of thing, and a little bit more electronic, I need to have some of these other sounds in there, which would be in other cues. And so like that kid's piano became one of those kind of things. Well, that would go in, and that, another sound might go in, like a glockenspiel, or things that I felt like were, there was also the auto harp, which plays that chord, which became like a signature Bully, and there was a little flute thing. They became these little things like that, and sometimes there was that motif, that doom 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 doom. Like when I came up with that, I was like, okay, this is this is like a reoccurring thematic thing, which I could then repurpose in these other cues. Sometimes when the music's really different, it's these kind of things that connect the dots between the wildly eclectic musical styles. And so that's kind of how I, in my head, conceptualized that whole thing.
Another challenge Lee faced was the way to soundtrack the various different clicks in the game. Some have obvious directions to go down, for example the chiptune-inspired music of the Nerds, but how would Lee make music that sounded preppy?
What are the preppies going to have? What's their music? Because they're going to have crap taste in music, the preppies, you know what I mean? They're going to have a strong, like, it's not going to be cool. It's got to be something like, like the Nerds were obvious. Like when I thought of Nerds, it made me think of the Revenge of the Nerds, and so it put me into that sort of like 80s kind of like, vibe. And it was going to be like Casio. It was going to be fun. It was going to be, and so, yeah, so you kind of like whatever your knee-jerk reaction was to something. If you had a strong feeling about what it was, then I went with that. And every now and again you would do a piece of music for something and they'd be like, you know what, we don't think that's right, but they would find another place for that track. They'd be, oh, but it's perfect in this, you know what I mean?
The most recognisable part of the whole Bully soundtrack is the glockenspiel-driven title theme, although Lee never set out for this to become the main theme. The opening section of the theme is based off of a constant semi-quaver rhythm played on the glockenspiel and a toy piano, which Lee found on a trip to Tokyo in December 2004. The playful nature of these continuous semiquavers evoke a childlike, innocent atmosphere, and the glockenspiel and toy piano are instruments that would actually be found in schools. And the timbre of the music, combined with rhythms, lend a sort of Mike Oldfield type quality to the piece. The harmony here has a slightly ambiguous, mysterious quality to it. The opening chord is in E minor, firmly establishing the harmonic world of the piece as E minor, but we quickly shift away from this as E flats and B flats are introduced. At this moment, the bass pattern shifts to playing a figure based on C, making the chord heard at this moment as C minor 7, making this a chromatic median or altered median chord. In the key of E minor, the chord of C is the 6th or submedian chord of the scale, but the alteration of the E to the E flat and the B to the B flat in the chord make it an altered median chord, a chromatic median. Despite the harmonic ambiguity here, the simple 1-5 bass line keeps the music feeling grounded. As we move into the next section, we get a descending chromatic line, which lands on the unaltered 3rd of C major, with the addition of the sharp 11 in the F sharps, moving us more firmly towards a purer E minor tonality. Behind the main melody, we can hear pizzicato strings, and it is a tried and tested cliche in soundtracks for pizzicato strings to have associations of lightheartedness or a generally ditzy feel. Though this is a simple and done-to-death cliche, in the context of a piece of music meant to evoke the nostalgia of school, this kind of basic cliche actually works very well. We hear the main melody again, though with the addition of a triangle, probably an instrument more than any associated with childhood and school. The section that follows has the same chord progression as the opening, but a melody with longer note values this time around. The bass line is built on semi-breathes rather than the continuous quavers of the opening. This keeps a similar vibe to the earlier section, but leans more into the mystery and wonder of youth rather than the playful aspect heard in the glockenspiels. As the music progresses, the feeling slows down even more, with a quaver bass line returning to keep the pulse, but now the glockenspiel and guitar only. With a new electric guitar melody, highlighting the natural and the flat fifth of the E minor scale, sliding up to it, lending this moment in the piece a distinctly bluesy feel. The other piece I'd like to look at in detail is called Welcome to Bulworth. On the surface, the constant glockenspiel makes it seem quite similar to the title theme. However, it's really rather different, for it leans far more into the creepy side of Bully. Bully is a game which is a lot darker than it initially appears, and not on technicalities or nitpicks at background details, but it really is quite a dark game at times. Violence, mental illness, abandonment, substance issues, and class are all themes tackled in a game that could really seem a lot more lighthearted. Jimmy Hopkins is clearly a very troubled protagonist, and although he's likeable, quick-witted, and roots for justice, he resorts to violence easily, and is only in the town of Bulworth due to his essentially being abandoned by his mother. The Hobo and Rudy the Bum Santa are somewhat prominently featured homeless characters, The main villain, Gary Smith, exhibits numerous sociopathic or psychopathic traits and is known to be on some form of mental health medication. The hobo's Korean War flashbacks hint at PTSD. There is an asylum featured in the game. Gary Smith dresses up in something very close to an SS uniform on Halloween. Mr. Galloway is a man juggling his professional and personal life with his alcoholism, and the poverty of the townies and the greasers is shown in stark contrast to the preppies. If you didn't know anything about Bully, this would sound like a really dark game, but it's all sort of hidden under the surface, making it a rather Lynchian game, and the piece Welcome to Bulworth exemplifies this. Like much of the Bully soundtrack, influence of Danny Elfman can be heard, and Elfman is a composer who Lee has described as a master of having something that is very naive and childlike, that also has a creepy darkness to it, that his Bully soundtrack should capture an innocence, but also a darkness. It opens with Glockenspiel again, though this time playing a triplet figure, lending a rollicking, forward-pushing motion to the section. The melody outlines a descending sequence, though the Aeolian feel here gives it a somewhat creepy tone. Tension is further created, with the constant A in the bass, a dominant note of the key of D minor. This constant glockenspiel figure doesn't stop throughout the whole piece. It's the shiny veneer underneath which something darker unfolds. The first thing to unfold is the interjection of an auto harp, bass guitar and wind machine, outlining the tonic chord of D minor. Eventually, we hear an electric organ doubling the main melody, except with a slight difference at the end, and occasional bass drum interjections, lending power and a low, strong energy to the piece. However, the organ part then shifts up by a third, and slightly alters, landing on a tense C sharp, the raised 7th of D minor, pulling us towards a pure minor tonality. This is where we get a sudden and drastic shift in the harmony and instrumentation. The organ is replaced by a choir of low, male voices, singing a chromatic part. The tonality here has shifted to F major, the submedian of A minor, with the harmony alternating between the 1 and 5 chords of the key, except with a sharpened 5th on the 5 chord, creating an unstable sounding augmented chord. This chromatic, low choir sounds brooding, creepy, yet another piece of darkness under the bright glockenspiel surface. A second male voice is then heard, a pitchless, creepy whisper, before the introduction melody and its first development are heard simultaneously, with an electric piano figure and new counter melody leading the piece to its ending, back on the tonic chord of D minor. Shawn Lee has also used a variety of production techniques to help his music convey the action of the game. For example, when the player's character has been awake for too long, the tired music plays. It's a development of the main theme, but Lee's production techniques help create a tired atmosphere. Its sluggish tempo of around 30 beats per minute is painfully slow and dragging, and when combined with heavy delay and reverb applied to the track, this creates a very drowsy feel. The slight tremolo and vibrato effect on the guitar give it an almost underwater feel, and a slight pitch drifting up effect makes it sound like a slow, broken record. Even if Bully's approach was more in the style of traditional film scoring rather than dynamic video game music, Lee was also given the challenge of creating seemingly endless stings for the game, the length of which proved something difficult.
Then at the end, it was, okay, now we need 50 stings. And I was like, oh, no. And a lot of them were like 5-second stings, which were really quite challenging. It's not like dun dun, that's like easy. It's like a 1 chord or a 2-note little thing. You could just do that all day long. You know what I mean? But like 5 seconds is like a really complete sentence. It's like da do bo 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 da da. And so that was tough, but it really was the hardest musical gig I've ever had. I think just from the sheer volume of stuff that had to be done, it was like being at war.
Bully's enduring popularity is in no small part down to its perfect soundtrack, which I consider to be gaming's greatest soundtrack of all. Lee himself hadn't actually seen the game played years until afterwards, when he saw his daughter playing it and finally heard his music in context. But having seen it in context, would Lee have done anything differently?
That was really, really interesting to see what they used, where they used it, how they used it, and the bits that, got, like the bits from one track which would be used when something happened and repurposed into these different ways. And, I got to see how well it worked together, and how it kind of set the atmosphere and framed the various characters, and it was really interesting. I think it really made me quite proud of it, because I think at that point I had realized that, over the years, that it was a score that meant something to people beyond the game in a way. Sometimes it was kind of like the music was so important in the game, but it had a life outside of the game, and that people really held the score in high regards and all that, and not really knowing what something was, I think was a very powerful process, because it's very suggestive, and it's like you're living in this completely make-believe world, and you don't even really know what's going to happen. So it's really done, it's just a pure imagination. I don't think I could have done it better had I known more about it. I think maybe it would have been different. Maybe it would have been as good. Maybe it wouldn't have. I don't know. Maybe it would have been more literal. I think maybe I think that the sense of not really knowing what it was going to be was a powerful thing, which created a very strong result.
Thank you very much for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and perhaps you would also enjoy my video on how David Lynch and Roy Orbison captured dreaming within their music.